For 16 long years, Rome lived with one name hanging over it like a storm cloud: Hannibal. Not just a general, not just a foreign enemy, a nightmare with a face. He had crossed the Alps when Rome believed those mountains were a natural wall, a barrier no sane army would ever try to break. He had brought the war into Italy when Roman leaders believed the real danger would stay far away, somewhere across the sea, somewhere outside the heart of their world. And then, one battle after another, he had shown Rome that confidence could become blindness. At Trebia, Roman pride bled into the river. At Lake Trasimene, an army walked into morning fog and found death waiting inside it. And at Cannae, Rome suffered one of the most terrifying defeats in military history. Tens of thousands of Roman soldiers, packed together, surrounded, crushed, and cut down until courage itself could no longer save them. For Rome, Hannibal was not merely a commander on a battlefield. He was a wound that refused to close. He was the memory every family feared. He was the name whispered whenever another army marched south, whenever another messenger arrived, whenever another rumor crossed the city. And yet, in 202 BCE, on a dry and dusty field in North Africa, the nightmare finally came home. Not to Italy, not to a battlefield chosen by Hannibal, not to the ground where he had spent years making Rome bleed. This time, Hannibal Barca stood near Zama, defending the world that had created him. The old lion of Carthage was no longer the invader deep inside enemy territory. He was no longer the man forcing Rome to react to him. He was standing on African soil, with Carthage behind him, its future resting on the result of one last battle. Across the plain stood a younger Roman commander, Publius Cornelius Scipio. He had grown up under the shadow of Hannibal's terror. He had watched his country suffer. He had seen what happened when Roman confidence met Hannibal's patience, deception, and timing. But unlike many men who only hated Hannibal, Scipio studied him. He studied the disasters. He studied the patterns. He studied the way Hannibal turned courage into a trap. And now, on the field near Zama, Scipio had come to answer a question Rome had carried for almost a generation. Could Hannibal still defeat Rome with the instincts that once made him look unstoppable? Or had Rome finally suffered enough, learned enough, and changed enough to turn the master's own method against him? For a moment, if a man looked across the battlefield, it might have seemed that Hannibal still had a real chance. He had elephants at the front. He had infantry arranged in depth. He had veterans who had followed him through the long war in Italy. Men who had survived marches, hunger, ambushes, Roman attacks, and years of uncertainty. And above all, he had a reputation so powerful that it could shake Roman hearts before the first spear was thrown. But reputation is a dangerous weapon. It can frighten the enemy. It can also imprison the man who carries it. Hannibal had built his legend by forcing Roman commanders to behave exactly as he wanted them to behave. He had used their aggression against them. He had used their pride against them. He had turned their confidence into panic, their formations into cages, and their courage into mass graves. But Scipio was not the same kind of Roman commander Hannibal had destroyed before. Scipio did not come to Zama merely to prove that Romans were brave. Rome had already proved it could be brave. It had proved that again and again, sometimes at a terrible price. Scipio came to prove something colder. He came to prove that Rome had changed. To understand why this mattered, we have to go back to the war that had brought these two men to the same field. The Second Punic War was not just a war between two armies. It was a war between two systems that could not comfortably share the same world. Carthage was rich, maritime, commercial, experienced, and deeply connected to the politics of the Western Mediterranean. Rome was stubborn, expanding, disciplined, and almost impossible to force into surrender. When Hannibal invaded Italy, he was not simply trying to win battles. He was trying to break the Roman system. He wanted to shake Rome's alliances. He wanted Italian cities to doubt Roman protection. He wanted to show the world that Rome could be beaten, not only once, but again and again, until the Republic's authority began to crack. And for a long time, it looked as if he might actually do it. He struck Rome with a level of tactical brilliance that still feels modern. Hannibal understood timing, he understood fear. He understood how quickly a battlefield could change when one commander saw the whole shape of the fight, and the other only saw what he wanted to see. He understood something many commanders learn too late. Armies do not break only when their bodies fail. They break when their minds realize that the battle they thought they were fighting has become something else. At Cannae, Hannibal made the Roman army believe it was pushing forward into victory. The Roman center pressed into his line, convinced that pressure would break the Carthaginian formation, but every step forward carried them deeper into danger. The line that seemed to bend was not collapsing, it was drawing them in. Then Hannibal's cavalry destroyed the Roman horsemen. Then it came back into the rear. Then the infantry closed from both sides. And what had looked like a Roman attack became a Roman prison. A disciplined army became a packed crowd. And the packed crowd became a slaughter. That memory stayed with Rome. It stayed with senators. It stayed with soldiers. It stayed with mothers waiting for sons who would never return. But Rome did something after humiliation that many states cannot do. It learned. Slowly, painfully, stubbornly, Rome stopped giving Hannibal the decisive battle he wanted in Italy. It rebuilt armies. It replaced commanders. It absorbed losses that might have destroyed another republic. It fought in Spain. It attacked supply routes, allies, and pressure points. It refused to let one disaster become the end of the state. And out of that long education in defeat, Scipio emerged. Scipio was not dangerous because he was brave. Rome had many brave men. Hannibal had killed plenty of brave men. Scipio was dangerous because he was willing to learn from the enemy without shame. He did not treat defeat as an insult to be forgotten. He treated it as information. He understood that a commander who refuses to study his own humiliation is only preparing to repeat it. In Spain, Scipio showed what kind of man he was becoming. He struck Carthaginian positions with speed and precision. He won allies. He learned to use Roman forces with more flexibility. He did not see the legion as only a heavy wall that pushed forward until something broke. He saw it as a machine that could open, shift, absorb pressure, and strike back at the right time. Most importantly, Scipio understood that Hannibal's genius was not magic. It was pattern. Hannibal created pressure. He made his opponent react. He used disorder as a weapon. He attacked the mind before he destroyed the body. Scipio saw that clearly. And instead of fearing the pattern, he prepared to break it. That is why Scipio's greatest move came before the Battle of Zama itself. He did not chase Hannibal around Italy. He did not allow the war to continue forever on Hannibal's terms. Instead, he sailed to North Africa and threatened Carthage directly. It was a cold and brilliant strategic move. If Hannibal stayed in Italy, Carthage might lose its homeland. If Hannibal returned, then Scipio would finally draw the great commander onto ground Rome could choose. So Hannibal came back. After years of war in Italy, after victories that had become legend, he returned not as the hunter, but as the defender. That change mattered. In Italy, Hannibal had made Rome answer him. At Zama, Scipio had made Hannibal answer Rome. And that may have been the first crack in the legend. The army Hannibal brought onto the field was dangerous. No one should imagine it was weak, but it was not the same perfect instrument that had once crossed the Alps and terrified Italy. It was a mixed army. There were newly raised troops. There were mercenaries. There were Carthaginian citizens and allies. There were veterans from the Italian campaign, hard men who had survived the long war and still carried the old fire. But these men did not all share the same experience, the same trust, or the same rhythm. They were not one perfectly unified blade. Hannibal's mind was still sharp, but the weapon in his hand was not as sharp as the mind that held it. Across the field, Scipio's army had its own risks. Rome had suffered before. Rome knew what Hannibal could do to even strong formations. But Scipio had one advantage Carthage could not ignore: cavalry. For years, one of the reasons Hannibal had been so dangerous was his cavalry. Carthaginian and Numidian horsemen had helped him control the edges of the battlefield, chase down broken enemies, and complete the destruction of Roman armies. At Zama, that advantage had shifted. Scipio had Massinissa, the Numidian leader, and with him came cavalry that could move with deadly speed across the field. What had once helped make Hannibal terrifying was now in Roman hands. Still, Hannibal had one weapon meant to shake even disciplined soldiers: war elephants. To modern eyes, elephants can almost seem like something from legend. But on an ancient battlefield, they were terrifyingly real. They were not simply animals. They were moving towers of fear, massive bodies of muscle and sound, capable of crushing men, frightening horses, and tearing open a line before the real infantry battle even began. Against unprepared troops, elephants could turn order into panic in seconds. A solid line could become men scattering for their lives. A horse could rear and refuse to move. A shield wall could open without being commanded. Hannibal placed the elephants in front. Behind them, he arranged his infantry in depth. The first lines would take the early violence and wear down the Romans. The next formations would continue the pressure. And at the rear stood the men he trusted most, the veterans, the hardcore of the army, the last blade of the old commander. This was not a foolish plan. It had logic. The elephants would break order. The forward infantry would force Rome into a grinding fight. The veterans would enter when the Roman line had been weakened, stretched, and tired. For a moment, the old Hannibal was visible. He was building the battle in stages. First fear, then pressure, then exhaustion, then the final blow. He wanted Scipio to survive the opening shock, but not survive it cleanly. He wanted Rome to hold just long enough to be worn down. He wanted the final line to meet not a fresh Roman army, but one already shaken by noise, dust, blood, and the belief that the worst had already passed. But Scipio had already looked into that future. He knew the elephants would come. He knew what Hannibal wanted them to do. And instead of packing his infantry into one dense wall, he arranged his maniples with lanes running through the Roman formation. His soldiers did not simply wait to be crushed. The Roman line became something stranger and more flexible. It became a wall with doors. The trap before the trap was already on the field. Then the elephants moved. Dust rose from the plain. The animals surged forward, driven toward the Roman line by their handlers. For the men standing there, it must have been a terrifying sight, not a neat shape on a map, not a symbol in a history book, but living mass coming toward them, huge and loud, carrying fear before it like another weapon. This was the first test of Scipio's preparation. If the Romans panicked, Hannibal's plan could begin to unfold. If the formation broke, the infantry behind the elephants could exploit the chaos. If fear did its work, the battle might already be leaning toward Carthage. But Scipio's men did not give Hannibal the panic he needed. Roman skirmishers harassed the elephants. Noise filled the air. Trumpets sounded. Men shouted. Javelins flew. The battlefield became confusion before the elephants could turn it into Carthaginian advantage. Some elephants became difficult to control. Some veered away. Some turned back toward their own side. Others rushed forward and passed through the lanes Scipio had prepared, moving between Roman units instead of smashing them apart. The opening blow had failed. Not completely, not harmlessly, but it had failed to become the disaster Hannibal needed. And in a battle between masters, that difference matters. Hannibal had not lost the battle in that first moment, but he had lost the clean beginning he wanted. The elephants had not shattered the Roman formation. They had not created the kind of disorder that could be exploited immediately. They had created fear, sound, and danger, but not collapse. And the difference between fear and collapse is everything. On the flanks, the cavalry battle erupted. Scipio's Roman and Numidian horsemen moved against the Carthaginian cavalry. Hannibal needed his cavalry to hold long enough for the infantry plan to work. He needed the center to become the decisive place. He needed time. But the Carthaginian cavalry could not dominate the field the way Hannibal's cavalry had once dominated Roman armies. Scipio and Massinissa had brought the very arm that could decide the battle from the outside. The fighting on the wings moved away from the main infantry struggle. Carthaginian horsemen were driven off, and the Roman and Numidian cavalry pursued them away from the battlefield. For a dangerous stretch of time, the center belonged to the infantry. And this is where Hannibal still had a chance. If his infantry could defeat the Roman foot soldiers before Scipio's cavalry returned, Zama might still belong to him. If the Roman line could be bloodied, exhausted, pulled out of order, and forced into the final veteran line too soon, then Hannibal could still revive the old nightmare. He could still make Rome believe it had survived the worst, only to discover that the worst had been waiting behind it. The first Carthaginian line met the Roman infantry in close combat. Now the battle became physical. Shields pressed into shields. Men shouted through dust. Spears and swords flashed at arm's length. Ancient battles were not clean arrows moving across a map. They were fear, heat, breath, weight, noise, and the terrible pressure of another man trying to kill you before you could kill him. A soldier did not see the whole battle. He saw the shield in front of him. He saw the weapon coming toward his face. He saw bodies at his feet. He heard commands, but not always clearly. He looked for the standard, for the man beside him, for any sign that the line still existed. Commanders planned in formations. Soldiers survived in fragments. The Roman front line pressed forward. The Carthaginian forward troops fought, but gradually they began to give way. And as the fighting continued, one of the hidden weaknesses in Hannibal's army became visible. His lines were not acting like one body. When the front line broke and tried to retreat, the troops behind them did not simply open and absorb them smoothly. Confusion spread. Some accounts suggest tension, even violence, between Carthaginian lines as men tried to fall back, and others refused to let disorder infect the next formation. This was a crack Hannibal understood very well. It was the kind of crack he had once forced into Roman armies. Now it was appearing in his own. Still, the battle was not over. Hannibal had not placed all his hope in the first line. He had built his army in depth for a reason. The Romans had won part of the fight, but winning part of a battle can be dangerous. Every advance costs order. Every success pulls men forward. Every enemy line broken tempts soldiers to believe that the whole thing is ending. For a moment, victory seemed to be moving toward Rome. That was the danger, because behind the broken forward lines stood Hannibal's veterans. These were not frightened new recruits. These were the men who had marched with Hannibal through Italy. They knew Roman methods, they knew hunger, they knew long roads, sudden attacks, and the grinding weight of years at war. They had lived inside the campaign that had made Hannibal famous. If any part of the Carthaginian army could still bring the old nightmare back to life, it was this final line. Scipio understood that danger. He did not allow the Roman advance to dissolve into a reckless chase. He did something quieter, and, in some ways, more impressive. He stopped. He recalled his men. He reformed them. That pause matters. It is easy to admire the commander who orders the charge. It is harder to understand the discipline of a commander who stops victorious men before their victory turns into disorder. Many commanders can unleash an attack. Far fewer can control success. The Roman line widened. The formations adjusted. The men who had pushed through the first phase of battle were brought back into order. Instead of meeting Hannibal's veterans as a tired, scattered mass, Scipio prepared them for the final test. Across from him, Hannibal's veterans waited. Now the battle had reached its purest form. The elephants had failed to break Rome. The cavalry had moved away from the center. The forward infantry had been spent. The opening tricks, shocks, and confusion had passed. What remained was Hannibal's last hard weapon against the Roman who had learned too much. When the two lines came together, the fight became brutal. This was not a simple Roman sweep. Hannibal's veterans were too experienced for that. They could hold, they could kill, they could make the Romans pay for every step of ground. The struggle in the center became a contest of endurance, discipline, and time. And time was the one thing Hannibal no longer controlled. That was the deeper problem. The battle was not only being decided in front of him. Somewhere beyond the dust, beyond the immediate violence of the infantry fight, Scipio's cavalry and Massinissa's Numidians were still moving. Hannibal needed the center to break before they returned. Scipio needed the center to hold until they came back. The entire battle narrowed to a race that no soldier in the center could fully see. Could Hannibal's infantry win quickly enough? Could Scipio's infantry survive long enough? Here, Hannibal's fatal mistake reveals itself, not as one foolish order, not as one simple blunder, but as a chain of assumptions shaped by his own greatness. Tactically, he had counted on the elephants and layered infantry to disrupt and weaken the Roman army before the final blow. But Scipio had prepared lanes for the elephants and discipline for the infantry fight. The first shock did not shatter Rome. The early lines did not create enough disorder. The veteran reserve entered a battle that had not unfolded the way Hannibal needed it to unfold. Psychologically, Hannibal still trusted the logic that had made him terrifying. Create disorder, exploit fear, force Rome into the old pattern of defeat. Make the enemy react. Let them think they are winning. Then close the trap. But this Roman army was not behaving like the armies he had destroyed before. It did not rush blindly into panic. It did not break when the elephants came. It did not lose control after the first success. It had been trained by disaster. Historically, the mistake was even colder. Hannibal was fighting with the instincts of his greatest victories, but the world around him had changed. Rome had adapted. Carthage had become desperate. The cavalry advantage had shifted. The army in his hands was not the same unified instrument of earlier years. Hannibal was still brilliant, but brilliance can become dangerous when it keeps trusting the battlefield that no longer exists. Great commanders are often not destroyed by what they do not know. They are destroyed by the instinct that once made them successful. Hannibal had won by making enemies walk into his design. At Zama, Scipio made Hannibal fight inside a design that had already accounted for him. The trap did not close all at once. It closed slowly. Then suddenly, as the Roman and Carthaginian infantry struggled in the center, the cavalry returned. Scipio's horsemen and Massinissa's Numidians came back from pursuit and struck the Carthaginian rear. The effect was devastating. Hannibal's veterans, already locked in a hard fight at the front, were now attacked from behind. The battlefield became what Hannibal had once created for Rome at Cannae, a killing space where courage could no longer solve the problem. There is a cruel symmetry in that moment. At Cannae, Hannibal's cavalry had returned to crush the Roman rear and complete the encirclement. At Zama, Roman and Numidian cavalry did the same to him. The master of the double envelopment was not defeated by an enemy who failed to understand him. He was defeated by an enemy who understood him too well. For the men in the Carthaginian line, The realization would not have arrived as a clean thought. It would have arrived as pressure, then confusion, then fear. A soldier fighting forward suddenly hears chaos behind him. He feels the line shift. He sees men turn their heads. He realizes that the rear, the place that should mean safety, is no longer safe. That is one of the most terrifying moments an army can experience. Not the first clash, not even the first death, but the moment men understand that the battle is closed around them. An army does not always break because every man chooses to run. Sometimes it breaks because every man understands at the same time that the fight has become unwinnable. The Carthaginian formation collapsed under pressure from both sides. Men were cut down where they stood. Others tried to escape through the chaos. The veteran line that had been Hannibal's final hope became trapped between Roman infantry and returning cavalry. The old pattern had returned. But it no longer belonged to Hannibal. It belonged to Scipio. When the killing ended, the Second Punic War was effectively decided. Carthage could no longer continue the struggle as an equal. Its greatest commander had been defeated on African soil. Its military position was broken. Its political leaders had to seek terms from the republic they had tried for years to weaken. But the peace that followed did not erase Carthage from the map. That would come later, in another war, under different conditions. Zama did not burn the city overnight. It did something more precise, and, in some ways, more important. It ended Carthage's ability to challenge Rome as the dominant power in the western Mediterranean. The treaty stripped Carthage of much of its power. It lost overseas possessions. It faced a heavy indemnity. Its fleet was restricted. Its ability to wage war independently was broken. The city survived, but the empire behind the city was no longer the same. Rome, meanwhile, emerged from the war transformed. It had survived Hannibal. That fact mattered almost as much as the victory itself. Rome had been invaded, humiliated, bled, forced to confront the limits of its old confidence. But it had not surrendered. It had adapted. It had found commanders who could think beyond tradition. It had learned how to absorb disaster without becoming paralyzed by it. Scipio's victory at Zama was not only a battlefield success. It was proof that Rome's system could learn from its worst enemy and become more dangerous because of it. And Hannibal, for all his brilliance, became the symbol of a colder truth. A commander can be great enough to change history and still be unable to control what history becomes after him. He had taught Rome fear. He had taught Rome caution. He had taught Rome that genius could destroy armies. But, by teaching Rome those lessons, he helped create the opponent who could finally defeat him. That is why Zama still matters. It was not simply a battle between Rome and Carthage. It was a duel between memory and adaptation. Hannibal carried the memory of victories so complete that they became part of his identity. Scipio carried the memory of defeats so painful that they became part of his education. One man had mastered the old nightmare. The other had learned how to wake from it. On that field in North Africa, Hannibal did not lose because he had never been brilliant. He lost because brilliance from the past can become dangerous when the enemy has spent years studying it. He lost because the weapon that once made him seem unstoppable had been understood, prepared for, and turned back against him. He lost because the age of Rome's fear was ending, and the age of Rome's dominance was beginning. The cold lesson of Zama is this: the most dangerous enemy is not the one who has never lost. It is the one who has lost, survived, learned, and returned with a memory sharp enough to become a weapon. Which commander was greater? Hannibal, the master of battlefield traps, or Scipio, the student who defeated him? Leave your answer below.